Well, today's scripture is about a boat ride. Now, back when I was a little boy, my family had a boat. And we used to go out on that boat all the time. And sometimes, to be honest with you, I was a little afraid of the boat. I guess my son got that same gift from me, because when we first got a boat, when he was around, he used to go, "No boat, no boat, no boat." Now, I wasn't really quite that bad, but my dad decided one day that he wanted to get me, probably, because my older brother had no fear in his life at all, but he wanted to get us a little over the fear of the boat and how we were afraid we might drown and all of that. So what my dad did is we got in the boat and we went out to the middle of Lake Erie, which was scary enough back then in the 60s, kind of water that was, but that's another story. And my dad put on a life jacket, just like this, a life preserver, and jumped into the water, which scared all of us because he was the one that used to drive the boat. And then he just laid in the water, put his arms out, put his feet up, and just floated around. And then he said to my mom, "Put jackets on Rick and Steve, and they can jump in with me." Well, we got these lovely orange jackets, and as soon as Rick put his on, he jumped right in the water. He wasn't afraid at all. He was in the water, he was doing everything that my dad was doing, but not me. I stood right on the edge of that boat, little tiny, we were talking before, I think it was a 15.5-foot Thompson wooden boat with a 35 horsepower engine on the back of it. But finally I got up the courage and I jumped in to that water. I jumped in and then knew what it was like to be able to float around. And in that short time, the fear that I had about the things around me, the fear that I had about the water around me, began to disappear, because I had a life preserver. I was wearing something that would protect me. I had this life preserver that was going to keep me safe through whatever it was that I had to face. So I went out in the boat a lot of times after that with my life preserver on. So when we got in storms, one time the engine failed and we were out in the lake and it was raining and it was just like the worst thing you can imagine. And my dad, who's not mechanical at all, was back there trying to get this engine to start, and I don't know why, but I had enough faith and trust in him that he was going to be able to do that. And to get out of the rain, Rick, and then I had a younger brother too, but Rick and Scott and I climbed underneath the bow of the boat, and that's where we sat until Dad got the boat running. But we weren't afraid. There wasn't that fear. Today in our scripture, we read, well, it sounds better now that I don't have this thing on, doesn't it? We read about the disciples, and we read about their trip on a boat. We read about how they reacted to that. Now, today you're going to get the NIV version of the scripture, and then you're going to get the SSL Langford version of the scripture after we read this. But if we can have the scripture up on the screen together, we'll read the scripture today. That day, when evening came, he said to the disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, he took them along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. His disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now that's the good translation. Now here comes mine. Here's Jesus. I love this backdrop I have too. If you want to take pictures, it's fine. Steve by the Sea of Galilee, that's what this is today. But if you stop and think, here's Jesus, a carpenter. Not a fisherman, but a carpenter. Now he gets on the boat with a lot of hotshot fishermen. These guys were big-time fishermen. They thought they knew everything. And I'm sure they thought that no matter what, they could handle any storm. And I think Jesus trusted them. Because just like me, when I climbed underneath that boat to get out of the rain, it says in the scripture that when Jesus got on the boat, he took a cushion, probably a life preserver, and went and laid down in the front of the boat and went to sleep. He just stayed up there. He was fine. He wasn't worried about a thing. The storm comes up, and all of a sudden, these fishermen, the people that Jesus thought, hey, this is what you guys do for a living. You ought to be able to handle it. The fishermen were overcome by the storm. They were scared to death. They didn't know what to do. But Jesus is still up in the front, sleeping away. He continues to sleep. Now, this is what I love about, here's the difference between the NIV translation and the Steve Langford translation. In the NIV, it says that they said to Jesus, wake up. They didn't say to Jesus, woke up. They yelled, Jesus, wake up! What's the matter with you? Don't you see we're all about to drown? It wasn't the King James, Jesus, please wake up. Don't you see? No, they were upset. They were scared to death. These strong men, these men who had for so many years been fishermen, been so many years out on the sea, now go out there and they find themselves scared to death. And they turn to Jesus. They say to him, teacher. They yell at him, teacher, don't you care if we drowned? Now, when I stop and think about that, I think, man, didn't these guys have a clue? They were with Jesus every day. They saw miracles every day. Didn't they have any clue? Didn't they have any idea? Why were they so afraid? Why were they so concerned? First, just like us, they tried to handle this on their own. So I am sure when the storm came up, they had ways to fight the storm. They tightened the sail or loosed the sail. They brought things in. They did all these different things to try to keep this from causing any problem. And I can hear them yelling orders to each other and working out what they're going to do. Cocky fishermen, hey, it's just a storm. It's not my first storm. We can handle this. Let's just get together. We'll take care of this. They all thought they could do it. The storm couldn't beat them. Basically, they said, bring it on. We got you. Let's see how good you are. Let's see what you can do, storm. And then, like I said before, they waited to the very last minute before they went and woke up Jesus, before they went to him. They waited when they had lost total control. All of a sudden, they remembered, hey, wait a minute. We got the Son of God, the King of Kings, the Messiah, asleep in the front of the boat. Maybe we should go wake him up. Maybe he can do something to help us out of this mess. Maybe he could remember. Now, while all this is going on, still remember, water's rushing over, spilling into the boat. It's rocking back and forth. There's probably thunder and lightning going on. Jesus is still asleep in the front of the boat like he doesn't have a care in the world. And the disciples then rush to him, and they try to wake him up. They try to get him going. Now, like I said before, it wasn't a simple little tap on the shoulder, a shake. It was probably a real big shake and a yell that, we're going to drown. Help us, help us. And they just woke him up, and then Jesus does what he does. It's interesting to me that part of this, I think the disciples are almost blaming Jesus for what's going on. Wake up, Jesus. Don't you care? Don't you care about what happens to us? Isn't it time for you to stand up and do something? Come on, it's time for you to take care of us. We're in trouble. We need you. What are you doing sleeping? You know, we all worked as hard as you did today. Then I start to say about how terrible those people must have been, how terrible the disciples were to treat Jesus like that. And then I stop and realize how many times I treat Jesus just like that. How many times in the peace that Jesus provides. See, in that boat was peace. The scripture tells us that Jesus doesn't promise to take us out of all this, but he promises to give us peace in the midst of the storm. So Jesus, the Prince of Peace, is able to sleep while all this is going on in the front of that boat because he knows that there is peace in there. In our world, when I get so upset, when you get so upset, when we think that there's nothing that we can do, that the world is so terrible, that everything is going wrong, God's not here, we say in the 60s, God's dead. All this we say and we stop and realize, then we stop and realize that it's us. That most of us who are amazed by the lack of faith of those disciples are men and women who have a lack of faith today. You and I, we say that we believe in Jesus and we love him so much, but when we get into those storms, when we're with the Prince of the Peace in those storms, how do we react? What do we do? I don't think we act any different than the disciples. We have the same question today that they had to Jesus. And interestingly enough, Jesus has the same question for us that he had when he stood up and calmed everything around. He says to us, do you still have no faith? After seeing all that you've seen, do you still have no faith? God says to us, this story says to us, that we need to have faith. Sometimes we've seen God come through for us. A lot of times we've seen that. We've seen God work in other people's lives. We still want to believe that the church is, miracles take place. We see that take place every day. But too many times when we see all this, we so quickly forget. Today, God says to you and me that we need to have faith. We need to believe. We need to step out and trust God. The other day, somebody was upset with us, the church, a church member, and came to me and said to me, back when this church was big, this is what we did. And then they started listing all these works that we did. Everything everybody was all involved in. We were doing all these things. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, that's probably true. You know, it was big and you did all those things. And yeah, that's right. But see, I don't think that's our problem today. Today, it's not about what we do. We could work like crazy. That doesn't mean the church is going to grow. We could do all kinds of things. We could have all kinds of gimmicks. We could do all different kinds of things. That's not how the church is going to grow. It's not about what we do. It's about who we trust. Very familiar portion of Scripture from Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, verses 5 and 6. And we're using the amplified version for this, so there's quite a bit more in it. But listen, trust in and rely confidently on the Lord with all your heart. And do not rely on your own insight or understanding. In all your ways, know and acknowledge and recognize Him, and he will make your path straight and smooth, removing obstacles along that block your way. Back in the days, they used to take little sayings, like my dad had one that said he was the captain of the boat, and it was up there by the steering wheel. Maybe the disciples should have taken this verse from Proverbs and had it in the boat with them. The scripture says for us to trust in God, to rely confidently in God. I believe that the disciples trusted in God. I'm not saying that they didn't trust in God. I believe every one of us in this room have trust in God. We even put it on our money. But there's the trust, and then there's this real confident trust. Trust that we believe that we can completely and totally trust in God. And that's what God is asking for us to do, as we sang, when we talk, even in all that we've done, trust and obey, all this we've talked about. God is saying to us, we need to have confident trust in Him. We need to trust in God. And as we begin to trust in God confidently, as we step out in confidence, the scripture goes on and says He's going to remove from us those obstacles that would cause us to fall. Now, is there any difference in what would have happened in that boat? Jesus calmed the storm when they didn't have faith. He was definitely going to calm it before they had faith, or if they had faith. God was going to be there. God was going to give to them that ability to confidently trust in Him. And He says to you and me today that He will give to us that confidence. It's not what God's willing to give. It's what we're willing to do. Today, you and I, this world we live in, we think that it's all about us. We think that I can take care of anything. I have the strength. I can go for this. I can do this. We read books, self-help books. We get ourselves all self-helped and ready to go, and we step out there and we think we can do all this. And then we start, and waves start washing over the boat. Perfect personal example. When I found out of all of that I had to write like 80 pages, 3 different papers for 80 pages, in total, for this to present to the district of, it's called DCOM. I don't know what all that stands for, but it was DCOM. But I had to do all this. At first I was all cocky. Pastor Brent kept telling me it's going to be easy to be a local pastor. All your experience, don't worry about a thing. It's going to be fine. Be a cakewalk. So I started to believe that. Then I found out I had to write those papers. Then I sat down and tried to write those papers. Now, it had been since 1998 when I finished seminary, and it took me 10 years, because I was an officer in the Salvation Army at that time. It took me 10 years to go through, to take all those classes in seminary. So I wasn't too excited. I didn't think I could write. And I sat down a couple of days, and I kept procrastinating and putting it off and off and off. And then I finally got to the point, like those fishermen, like those apostles, the disciples in the boat, that I realized I was going to drown. I realized I couldn't do that. So sitting at my little kitchen table or whatever at our house, with my computer up there for days and days with nothing printed on it, I finally just said to God, I can't do this. Like those fishermen, I'm so frustrated with this, it's driving me nuts. I can't do this. Right away, God took over. There was a man that was, I'm still trying to figure out if he was an angel or what, but He started coming to Genesis. His name is Bob Foxworthy. And, I was talking to him. Him and I were going out and having coffee and stuff like that. And so one day, this was the same day that I decided that I couldn't do this on my own. I said something to Bob about how, he said something about how he was nervous about something. I said, yeah, I understand. I got to write these papers. And he goes, oh, you got to write papers? I said, yeah, I got to. Well, he writes books. He writes journals and manuals for companies about staff relations and employees and all that kind of stuff. So he said, oh yeah, I'm writing a book now too. He says, maybe I can help you. And then we started meeting every Friday for a few weeks in a row. And Bob was so good for me. He sat there telling me, oh, that's really good. And he convinced me, as you know, I'm a storyteller. So he said to me, Steve, you're such a good storyteller. Use the stories in your paper. They fit. Then you can match it with, with all we need to do with the other stuff. John Dow, God bless John Dow. I guess when way back somebody gave him, well, I know how it happened, but it's a long story. But they gave him a set of commentaries. The very set of commentaries that the United Methodists wanted me to use to be able to write those papers and reference that in those, and reference from those commentaries. Costs hundreds of dollars. There's 12 volumes. It's real big. John walks into my office one day and says, I have these interpreters' commentaries. Would you want them? I said, you're kidding me. I said, that's exactly what I need. All that Pat did with proofreading, and you should have seen the first, you know how your teachers take red pens and write all over the stuff? The first time I printed it out and handed it to Pat, Paul, she had more red on there than there was black ink from the typewriter, listen to me, from the computer. But see, God sent these people right there at that time. When I finally gave up, when I finally realized that the only one I could have confident trust in was Jesus Christ, God came, sent me those angels to help me get through this. And I did it. We did it. I don't know what Jesus was asking, why. I don't want Jesus asking us why we don't have faith. And the scripture is very clear why we don't want him asking that question. Hebrews 11:6 says this, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. As his children today, we need to express that faith that we have in Jesus Christ. We need to show him that we have faith in him, that we are growing in confidence to him leading in our lives. When we're growing in confidence to depend on the fact that he is our life preserver, and that we can put him on and we can jump in to any sea, no matter how difficult that sea might be, and be able to trust. Now, it's not easy to trust. I know that very well. But there's also scripture in Mark, the 9th chapter, the 24th verse, where a young man comes to Jesus with his boy who's sick. And Jesus is really getting upset. Remember when I talked about last week that Jesus had days so things really didn't go the way he liked? I called him, he did it for Don Cooter, so it was a good Don Cooter day. I think what we're reading about with Jesus with these disciples in the boat was another one of those days. But here's another one of those days where the disciples can't help this man, no one can do anything. So finally they get the boy in front of Jesus, and he says to Jesus, if you can only help, if you can just do that, Jesus. And Jesus, immediately, the boy's father, Jesus said to him that all you have to do is believe, and your son will be healed. This is what the father said: I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. That's where you and I live every day. With our belief in Jesus Christ, our belief in God, and that percentage of us that still has, or percentage of what's inside of us that still has that disbelief, that still does not completely trust in Jesus Christ. You and I need to do all that we can to have more and more of Jesus and less of us. More and more trust in Jesus and less trust in us. Jesus says to us that if we are to make it through here, if we're going to make it through the storms of life, we need to trust in our life preserver, in Jesus Christ. If we're going to overcome our unbelief, it depends on us trusting in God. One of my favorite scripture verses, Philippians 4:13, says to you and me today that I can do all things through him who gives me strength. So here you are. We're out in the boat of life. A storm comes up. We're sitting there, this congregation, it's a big boat. We're all looking back and forth at each other, and we go over to Jay Stark because he's an old boat guy, and we say, hey, Jay, what are we supposed to do? And Jay starts trying to fix the motor, and we're trying to get the boat moving. We're struggling. The storm gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Halfway through this battle, this storm, we look up at the front of the boat. There's Jesus, sound asleep, like he has no care at all. And we're faced with a choice. A strange choice, but a choice nonetheless. We can stay there fighting the storm. We can stay there thinking we're strong enough to do this. And we can overcome this storm. Or we can all walk up the front of the boat, lay down next to Jesus, and take a nap. Because in that storm, we know that no matter what happens, we can confidently trust Jesus to get us through the storm. We can confidently trust Jesus to lead us through the struggles of life. When I have my memorial service in, let's say, 25 years, we're going to sing the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. Because I'm hoping and praying that by the time that day comes, I'll be totally confident and dependent upon Jesus in my life. All the storms that I've gone through, all the storms that you're going through. Some of you are going through very, very difficult storms even right now. God says to us that we can make it through that storm if we trust in him. If we put our full confidence in Jesus Christ, we can know that he's going to take us through the storm. When Danny selected this hymn, he sent a description of how the author got to the point of writing, "It is well with my soul." Horatio G. Spafford, a 43-year-old Chicago businessman, suffered financial disaster in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. He and his wife were still grieving over the death of their son shortly before the fire, and he realized they needed a vacation and needed to get away. Knowing that their friend Dwight L. Moody was going to be preaching an evangelistic campaign in England that fall, Spafford decided to take the entire family to England. His wife and 4 daughters went ahead on the USS Ville du Havre, and he planned to follow in a few days. But on the Atlantic Ocean, the ship was struck by an iron sailing vessel and sank within 12 minutes. 263 lives were lost, including Spafford's 4 daughters. When the survivors were brought to Cardiff, Wales, Mrs. Spafford cabled her husband, "Saved alone." Spafford booked a passage on the next ship, and as they were crossing the Atlantic, the captain pointed out the place where he thought the ship that his wife and family were in went down. That night, Spafford penned these words, "When sorrows like sea billows roll, it is well with my soul." We're going to sing that hymn as our closing hymn. If God is speaking to you today, if you don't know how to trust Jesus because you don't know Jesus, today is the day where you can ask Jesus to reveal himself to you, to come into your life, come into your heart, and be that life preserver that you need. That's the first group that we talk to today. The others of us are in this constant struggle. Trust, take it back. Trust, take it back. Trust, take it back. God says to us that he wants us to grow in that trust. He wants us to grow to the point. So as we stand and sing this hymn, I would encourage you, if God is speaking to you, to come forward and pray and ask God to give to you the confidence to trust in him. Or if you don't know Jesus, come forward and ask Jesus to reveal himself to you. Let's stand together and sing our closing hymn.